Good afternoon, everyone. I am super happy to see that many people in the room today after 2 years of online conferences, so it's kind of nice to see people sitting there in the same room. And we are a little bit late, so I propose to move on directly with the welcome addresses. You will hear first Philippe Delfosse, who is the strategic advisor to the Vice Rector for Research at the University of Luxembourg. Then we will have Benjamin Bagot, who is representing the National Institute of Statistics and Economic Studies of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, and they are co-organizing this conference. And finally, Jean-Paul Berthemes, Head of Science in Society at the Luxembourg National Research Fund. So, Philippe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Patricia. Welcome, everybody. I don't need to introduce myself anymore, so that's a good point. I'm not used to use a paper to give a talk, but the topic is quite audacious in my view, so I have some notes. So today we'll talk about if only data could talk. It's part of a project, an H2022 project, that aims at studying the sound of data when science meets music. Very interesting. I know that among the people there are many musicians, there are many scientists, so we are already meeting together. The Sound of Data is a collaborative project between the Luxembourg National Research Funds, the FNR, the University of Luxembourg, the Luxembourg Institute of Science and Technology, the LIST, and the Rock Lab in the Rock Hall. So the purpose of the project was to create bridges between science and music, the world of science, the world of music, so it's very broad, and by using data sonification. This is very strange to me. I would like to see a sample, or hear a sample. And this is for artistic purpose, but also for science communication. And that's the purpose of the meeting today. And to achieve this objective, LIST has collected data which are meaningful for societal perspective and that are related to the site where we work today, so Belval. They involved traffic data, history data, crowdsourcing, art data, and 3D body scan. Good. STATEC provided data collected during the pandemic, COVID, and 12 local and international artists who are currently attending an artist residency at the Rocal are using these data sets to generate sounds and ultimately music. They are supervised by an expert, Valérie Vermeulen, an artist in sonification. I invite you to discover their work on the 3rd of December. They will present all this work, and also you will find a lot of information on their website, the sound of data in one word.lu. And now, if I can, I will make a small parenthesis because I have to admit that to make the link between science and music, it was quite tough for me. And I'm going back to this. It's a light bulb. The light bulb was invented by Thomas Edison in the 1800-something. And because he was a very clever guy, he didn't want to spend too much time in testing. He tested 6,000 different materials to eventually find that carbon could be a suitable filament. And to save time, he put 2 or 3 filaments in one bulb, just to test more, and avoiding too much work to make those bulbs. But what he found out is that when one filament was powered and glowing, there was a transfer of electron from one filament to the other that was not under power. He discovered that these electrons were moving from one filament to the other. This remained quiet for a while until another guy, I think is Fleming, who in the early years of the 1900s pursued the work to bring the bulb light to the tube valve. This tube is actually a diode, so when the filament is glowing, it's transmitting electron to the other 2 plugs, and it's converting AC to DC, another very well-known band, music band. AC/DC was then born at the time. The work went on, and researchers tried to reduce the vacuum because vacuum is not useful here. There's a lot of space there. And that's how the transistor was developed. During the Second World War, they needed radio, radar that you could carry on the battlefield, unfortunately. So, yes, this was the birth of the transistor. And where my talk is going is that thanks to all of this, I have nothing more in my pocket, don't worry. These transistors were at the basis of the computer that we use today, enable us to digitalize music, to make sonification. So I believe that Thomas Edison was at the origin of our meeting today. Today's conference is on sonification, a tool that will convey data-driven knowledge and communicate science to the large audience. This topic is, of course, of utmost importance for the research ecosystem in Luxembourg, but particularly for the university, as I feel that mixing and meeting the world of science and the world of music would be a very wonderful topic to discuss in your brainstorming session today for the Institute of Advanced Studies, where we promote interdisciplinarity and mixture between scientists and musicians and people from the world of art. Today you will be amazed by the keynote speakers, Duncan Geere and Miriam. And when I look at the panel of the participants, I see so many people already holding the expertise in science and music. So I'm sure this conference will be a big success. Thank you.
I will be very short, my part. We are also pleased to welcome you and to be associated with the Son of Data conference at STATEC. And as you know, STATEC collects, analyzes data and produces content for experts and the general public. And we are particularly interested in current innovation in the field of information science and new format of knowledge transmission. We believe that this visual and audio innovation will help us in the future to understand, design, and disseminate the increasing amount of data that we will have to collect and understand. That is why we hope that you will take us as much pleasure as us in listening to the expert gateway today by the Son of Data. Thank you.
So this is part of my experiment I'm going to do with you now. Okay, so welcome to everybody. My name is Jean-Paul Butmus from the Luxembourg National Research Fund. We are the project leader of the Sound of Data project. And what I'm going to do here today with you is start with an experiment. It's in fact a data sonification experiment, and it's about the eternal philosophical question whether the glass is full or not, or how full is the glass. Yeah, so we have here a glass of wine, and if I do this here, you hear a sound. Yeah? So what do you think? If I pour some more wine now into that glass, will the sound go up or down? What do you think? Who's for the sound goes up? Who thinks that? Who thinks the sound will go down? Okay, most of you, so go and listen to it. Go in some more. This sound is nice too. And now, some more. More wine is always good. So the sound went down. Now, another question. If I blow into this bottle here, yeah, if I now pour some more wine in it, so the volume is reduced, what happens now? Will the sound go up or down? So who thinks the sound will go up? It normally should when it's the same logic as here, yeah? Who thinks the sound goes down? Okay, so you're right, so those who thought the term goes down were right. So what's the explanation behind this? In fact, the glass, it's a different thing. The glass vibrates here, and the more liquid you have, the more it prevents the glass from vibrating, and thus the tone gets lower. But here, it's the air that resonates, so the longer the air column is, the longer the waves are, and therefore the tone gets deeper. So two different phenomena. But two, I think, funny experiments about data sonification that show in which sense sounds can give you information about data. In that sense here, the volume of air or water in the glass or the bottle. Thank you. And in fact, I wanted to show you this experiment also because you now realize that we as FNR, we love to do experiments. And this is one of the first, that's the first reason, in fact, why we were participating in this project, The Sound of Data, because we see it a little bit as an experiment. But there are also other reasons. We, perhaps for those who don't know us, we are the main fund of research activities in Luxembourg, but we have also by law the mission to promote scientific culture. We do this by bringing together scientists and society, for example, in our Researchers' Days or the Science Festival, or we bring together scientists and students in schools in the Chercheurs à l'École program, or scientists and politicians in the Parent Scheme program, but we also have web and media platforms, and we offer funding and training. So in fact, what we do is we stimulate and promote the exchange between scientists and society. And in this project, so it's the exchange between scientists and musicians. But there is another, just to start, the starting point of that project was our Science Meets Music event on 1st May at Rock Hall. And there, in fact, people could discover the many fascinating links between science and music in an event where 800 visitors participated, and really the event rocked. But there's a third reason why we engage in this project. In fact, we are very active in science communication. So we have lots of different formats. We have, for example, Mr. Science on TV and on radio. We have the Science.lu with the associated social media channels as TikTok, Instagram, and so on. Then we have Zielmarkering on TV and so on. So we are always very interested in finding new ways to communicate science to the general public. And in fact, we have two approaches on how we communicate science. So the first one is the more, I would say, the more fun, the creative, and the innovative approach. The big advantage of this is that like this, you can fascinate people, and perhaps you can reach out also to target audiences that are difficult to reach. And to target audiences who may think that science is a little bit boring, too rational, not enough emotional. Music transports emotion very well, and everybody loves music. So we thought it would be a good idea to bring that together. But we also believe that science and science communication has to tackle the big challenges of our modern times. So we are also very much looking at which topics are relevant for science and for society, and we want to tackle this, identify them, then really make science checks and try to communicate via different means to our target audiences. And to tell you some of those examples of topics that we chose over the last years is for sure the coronavirus pandemic. We made over 100 articles about the coronavirus pandemic, but also topics like 5G, legalization of cannabis, and more the media, in fact, they use Science.lu as a resource to inform themselves or made interviews with us. And another very important topic we see for science and for society, this is big data. So that's the fourth reason why we engage in this project, is because we are very much convinced that talking about the enormous amounts of data science and society is confronted with, we should pay attention to that. And here are just some major challenges when dealing with big data is, for example, how to find meaningful patterns in all the data, or how to communicate in a meaningful way, or how to visualize data. And we then thought, okay, it's worth to make really a conference about this topic, and that's why we are here today, and that's why we have invited so many experts that can give us their opinion on what are the challenges and the opportunities of communicating data to the general public. And so thank you very much for all the keynote speakers and the panelists that are here, and thank you very much to all of you that came to listen to the conference. And now I need to finish my bottle.
Oh, yeah, well.
Thank you.
So, we're getting very close to our keynote speak. But while preparing for today's presentation, I had a talk with Emma, who will be on the panel later. And she reminded me that this year marks the 60th anniversary of a book called Silent Spring. This book was published in '62 and explained how the use of chemicals and pesticides was damaging the bird, insect, and animal populations. And the title, by the way, was inspired by a poem of John Keats, which evokes a ruined environment in which, I quote, "The sedge is withered from the lake and no birds sing." So by coincidence, or maybe not, our two keynote speakers, Duncan and Miriam, recently released a podcast called The End of the Road, in which they have sonified data on the declining insect population in Denmark. And so in some way, you guys managed to convey the sound of a silent spring, or increasingly silent spring. Duncan Geere is an information designer based in Helsingborg, Sweden, interested in climate and the environment. He works to communicate nuanced, complex information to a wider audience for clients like Information is Beautiful, the Gates Foundation, and Project Drawdown. He currently works part-time for the climate charity Possible, and he's also a generative artist and musician. Miriam Quick is a data journalist, researcher, and author who explores novel ways of communicating data. She has written data stories for the BBC, worked as a researcher for Information is Beautiful and the New York Times, and co-created artworks that represent data through images, sculpture, and sound. Miriam was awarded the Royal Society's Young Person's Book Prize 2021 for her first book called I Am a Book, I Am a Portal to the Universe, co-authored with Stephanie Pozovec. So please, the floor is yours, and you'll find your presentation on your laptop.
Thank you. All right. So, where do we get the wine? We only got given water.
We need some wine right now.
Yep. So, here is our presentation. And if I can see over there, let's go up to the beginning. And we are good to go. All right. Almost good to go. Full screen. Let's do it. Then you don't see the browser tabs. OK.
Amazing. Thanks for your patience there. And thank you for inviting us to speak today at this incredibly exciting event. So I'm Miriam Quick, and this is Duncan Geere. And we're going to talk today about data sonification. That's the practice of turning data into sound and sometimes even music. So just as data can be visualized by transforming it into bars and into lines and into colors, it can also be sonified, so turned into pictures, volume levels, and various audio effects, and much more. So using sonification techniques, you can tell stories with sound, you can add audio to visualizations, and you can even create pieces of music, as I said, all driven by data. We very much hope that by the end of this talk, you'll be totally convinced that sonification is a powerful technique that is worth exploring. Patrizia has already introduced us really well, but a little bit about who we are. I'm a data journalist. I write data stories for the BBC and other publications. I also work on data viz pieces for clients with creative agencies. And I particularly like to explore unusual ways of working with data. I create data artworks, and I'm also a musician. I'm actually a musician by background. I have a PhD in musicology. And I really enjoy working across different media. So I've turned data into everything from charts, graphics, and books, to necklaces, engraved 12-inch records, and, of course, sonifications.
And yeah, so I am an information designer, as Patricia told you before. I live in Sweden. I have a background as a journalist, but over the last kind of 5 or 6 years, I've been doing more and more data visualization work. And then, yeah, about 3 years ago, we started looking at sonification as an art form. Unlike Miriam, who has her PhD, I have no formal music training whatsoever. I have spent a whole chunk of my life listening to and loving music, and I love also finding new ways of exploring and representing data. And so I think it was only really natural that I would start connecting it with my love of music. So yeah, at the end of 2019, just before the pandemic, Miriam and I were at a conference, and I pitched her this wild idea that I'd had of making a data sonification podcast. And she sort of gave me a, I'll think about it kind of answer. And then a couple of days later, she emailed me and was like, yes, let's do it. And so after a few terrible name ideas like data tune and sonority, we decided to call it Loud Numbers. And after about 18 months of fitting in bits and pieces of work on it around our various freelance projects, we released the first season of the podcast in the middle of 2021. And you can listen to it on whatever your favorite podcast platform is. Each of our 5 episodes in the first season introduces a data story, and then we map different parts of the data to different sounds. And then finally, we play a piece of music that we've made out of those sounds. And we're pretty proud of it. I think that there isn't anything else that exists quite like this on the internet, and it's been a really fun, weird adventure to go on over the last few years.
So as Duncan said, there are 5 episodes in our podcast, and each has an accompanying music track. And we really wanted to explore a range of different musical styles and genres in this podcast, from techno and jungle right through to classical music. The first episode is called The Natural Lottery, and we take data from an Alaskan sweepstake where people place bets on river ice melt dates in a town called Nenana in Alaska. They've actually been doing this for more than a century, since 1917. And so we turned their detailed historical records into a techno track.
Of course.
Of course, as you do. And the system that we used is the higher the pitch of the chords that you hear in the techno track, the earlier the ice on that river melted that year. As climate change kicks in, the chords get higher and higher.
So I think we've got a little audio sample for you here.
Yeah.
1933.
So that was just a very short sample, but you can probably hear the chords getting higher and higher in the background. Here's another episode of our podcast. It's called Boom and Bust. And in this one, we use data on the US economy since 1968 to dictate the drum pattern in a jungle track. So when the economy grew, which was most of the time, the drums play forwards as normal. But when it was in recession, we reversed the sound sample so that it actually plays backwards. And there's also a sample, we wanted to flag this up so people could really hear when the economy goes into recession. So we added another sample that says, cool down the dance hall when the economy starts to cool down. This one is kind of loud, so be warned. So that gives you a bit of a flavour of the podcast. And since it was released, we've launched Loud Numbers as a sonification studio, and we've taken on several commercial projects as well.
So that's Loud Numbers. I think it would also be interesting maybe to listen to some examples of some sonifications that have been created outside of the loud numbers world and break them down a bit in terms of kind of what is actually happening with them. So this is a piece called Egypt Building Collapses by Tactical Tech, which is a non-profit organization. And this is kind of interesting because it's very direct. It sonifies collapsing buildings in Egypt with the sound of collapsing buildings. So I'll play a little chunk of this here. Is this going to work? Ah, there we go. So as you can see, there is an audio component and a video component, an animation. And it's really direct. It kind of presents these very tragic events with a very deep, visceral, emotional impact that you wouldn't get if you just saw the chart alone or if you saw a bar chart of the same data. It has a real emotional resonance to it. I just played it again. So, then this is a piece that I worked on with an information designer called Valentina Di Filippo. And this sonifies the progress of COVID through London in the first half of the pandemic. And you can hear that as the sound rises, those are cases and deaths peaking. And in the background, there's also a sample that plays that gets louder as more and more people get vaccinated over that time. And I think what's interesting about both this one and the previous one is that they both combine the sound world, the sonification, with video and visuals to create something that has a really strong emotional resonance, but it doesn't look like a traditional visualization or something like that. So I'll pass you back over to Miriam.
So then there's this video from the Financial Times, the FT, which is all about how they've turned this rather obscure financial metric, obscure to me anyway, it's called the yield curve, and they turned it into sound. And it's a really nice deep dive into the process of making a sonification. I totally recommend that you go and watch the full version of this video, which is about 7 minutes long. And one reason why I think it's so effective is that it really helps to make these very abstract numbers much more concrete and relatable. So I'm going to play a little bit of that now. I'm going to give it a few seconds.
Everyone get off the internet.
Yeah.
Error 5. Okay.
Error 5.
Sorry about that.
We're going to move on, but you've got the reference. It's the Financial Times. It's one of the few sonifications that they've done, so definitely go and check that out. And there's many more examples like this in a really great resource that you can find at sonification.design. It's called the Data Sonification Archive. We think it's a really great resource for inspiration. It was launched, I think, this year, and they've already got 374 different sonifications there across all fields. But why would you want to make something like this anyway? So why is sonification useful? Well, one reason is that sonification can tell very impactful stories. It can do many things, in fact, but a really important thing for us is that it can be a brilliant communication tool. And breaking this down a bit, in our experience, there are 5 key things that sonification can deliver that can be super useful in the data storytelling process. The first one is emotional impact. So people have emotional associations with music and with sounds, and these can be very, very physical and even visceral. So a sonification can get so loud that it hurts, but you couldn't ever have a bar chart so long that it hurts, not in 2D anyway. So we believe that new communication methods are needed to really cut through the apathy and disengagement that people often feel towards many topics, and particularly the environment. We think sonification is one way to help people engage emotionally with this type of data. The second thing that sonification delivers is immersiveness. So sound is very immediate, and it can even be intrusive. So think of a noisy car alarm or a phone ringtone on a train. These things are really hard to ignore. And both of these examples, by the way, the car alarm and the phone ringtone, are sonifications. So sound is very good at cutting through and alerting you to some new information. And also, with sound, you can create an amazing sense of place. You can take people to another world. So that place, it doesn't have to be a real soundscape, although it can be based on one. It can simply be the soundscape of the data itself. Because of this immersiveness, sonifications afford a very different experience of data than visualizations do. I really like this quote by the philosopher Donna Haraway about visual bias in the way that science typically imagines the world, which she calls the God trick of seeing everything from nowhere. So this quote is often applied to data visualization because static charts give you a global overview of a data set, which means you can see everything at once. So this can make it easy to believe that you are separate from what the chart represents and that your view of the data, as well as the data itself, is perfectly neutral and perfectly objective. To be clear, this is a view about data that we're quite skeptical of. So striving for objectivity is a very laudable aim and can be very useful in many situations. But fundamentally, data is gathered and represented and understood by human beings with all their biases, faults, and idiosyncrasies. So let's rewrite that quote for sonification. We can say that sonification offers you the human trick of seeing something from somewhere. So a limited amount from a limited perspective. And that can be very, very valuable as well.
So a third big benefit of sonification is around accessibility. Sonification can really broaden inclusion of data storytelling by bringing its magic to people who have a permanent or a temporary visual impairment, or even a person who is just like not looking directly at a screen at any given moment. As a nice example, and hopefully this one will play, this project was created for an organization called Data for Change. It's called Hear the Blind Spot, and it's a really nice example of a web page that uses sonification to be more accessible to visually impaired people. There is a voiceover as well as text. The text is large and it's high contrast, and most importantly, the charts are sonified using a flute sound. So let's give this a try. Cross your fingers. Okay, I think we're going to have to abandon some of these examples.
And I love playing.
There we go, we got it.
Let me tell you about my country through music. Ethiopia has the second largest population in the whole of Africa. People here are living 20 years longer than they were in 1990, the year I was born. Hear how life expectancy has grown from 47 years to 66 years. This is all thanks to public health programs that led to huge reduction in child mortality.
So I don't know if you noticed something there in the sonifications. There's a really small design touch in them that I really love. Did you hear the little click sounds in the background? Yeah, I see nodding. So these are really, really helpful as a way of indicating time passing, but also to indicate time periods where there's no data. It's really, really helpful for people to keep track of where they are in the data set.
I'm Desta.
No. There we go. Okay, a fourth benefit of sonification, which is kind of related to accessibility, is that sonification can create compelling data storytelling experiences in audio-only formats, which could include radio or podcasts or even perhaps audiobooks, I guess. And we did this on the Loud Numbers podcast, of course, but there are also plenty of other examples. This podcast from The Economist, for example, uses sonification to dramatize data around gender inequality. While having children has no effect on a man's wages, women's average wages plummet after they give birth, and they don't ever quite recover, a phenomenon that's known as the motherhood penalty. The Economist represented this really, really well as a piano melody whose pitches decrease in step with the data. And I'll give this one slightly longer.
This node
there we go.
represents the average salary of a Swedish father-to-be 1 year before having a child. Each following lower node represents a drop of 1%. After 5 years, the average father's salary has gone back up to its pre-chart level and beyond.
And so what about Swedish mothers? How does the motherhood penalty look for them?
So in Sweden, after 10 years, a mother's salary goes from here to here. That's a drop of 27%.
Which sounds like a lot. I mean, how does that compare to other countries that might have different policies?
Well, British mothers earn 44% less than before they had a child. And mothers in my home country, Germany, are the most affected.
Wow, so Germany really hits some low notes. Marie, thanks very much for sounding this out with us.
Thank you, Jason.
It's kind of amazing, isn't it, that you really feel something with that in a way that you wouldn't if you were just looking at a bar chart, right? So.
This node.
No.
Represents.
Come on. There we go. OK. And then finally, we should really be honest here. There is a novelty factor to sonification right now, and it gets headlines just for being sonification. And, you know, I kind of hope in some ways that this isn't going to last forever, because if it does last forever, then that means we've not been successful in bringing it to the world and making it so that everybody sees and hears sonification regularly. But for the time being, it can be useful. If you're working in the field of science communication, which I know many of you are, it can grab attention in a way that more traditional approaches to representing data just don't. Now, you might have noticed something here, which is that all of the examples of sonifications that we've played you so far use data that is arranged over time. And that's because time series data is a natural fit for sonification, whether it is quarterly economic growth, or annual chocolate bar sales, or decadal average temperatures. With a bit of cleaning and aggregation, it's probably going to work OK if you sonify it. And the reason for that is that sound itself unfolds over time. So there is a very direct relationship. You're essentially compressing the duration of your data down into the duration of your sonification. And time series data is probably the easiest kind to start with, but it's not the only kind of data that can be sonified. Here, as another example, is a sonification that I worked on for my employers at the climate change charity Possible, with a developer named Karim Douaib. And it sonifies geographical data on noise pollution in cities. So let me hit play on this one. As you move the mouse across the map, you can hear what noise pollution sounds like in any specific location. It's really fun to play with. And just this interactivity factor of being able to move your mouse over the map makes it a really compelling experience.
So there's a whole bunch of examples there. Hopefully we have whetted your appetite for doing some sonification work yourself. So how do you actually go about this? How do you go about making your own? Well, here's one approach. It's not the only one, but it is the one that we take at Loud Numbers. So we always start with a story. What is an interesting question that we can explore with data? And then we look for available data sets around that story. And at the same time, we think about the mood or the sound world that we want to create in the sonification, a little bit like you might create a mood board for a data visualization. Then we develop the sonification system. So this is when we start to nail down the specifics, like the number of data layers that we're going to have, the instrument or sound choices, how exactly the data is mapped to sound. And we'll explain what we mean by mapping in a second. And if we're using time series data, you know, how data time is compressed into musical time. So, for example, with our podcast, our tracks needed to be between about 4 and 10 minutes long. So we had to decide, given the length and the granularity of our data set, should one bar of music equal a day or a month or a year of data? We often make code sketches at this stage using a free tool called SonicPy to see how things sound, and then we gradually refine these sketches to produce audio tracks. Sometimes we use the Loud Numbers VCV Rack module, which we'll say a little bit more about shortly. And then finally, we make the music track. We often use Logic Pro, which is Apple's music software, to do this, but you could use any music software. And at this stage, we define the instruments used, we add non-data musical layers and effects, and we mix the result down. So let's look a little bit closer at the third step, which is defining the sonification system. So how exactly do you transform data into sound?
And at this point, it's kind of useful to take a bit of a broader look at the landscape of sonification for a second. In 2002, a sonification researcher named Thomas Hermann proposed 5 different categories of sonification, which we like to simplify down to 3. Audification is the least abstract. It's when you get a bunch of data and you use time stretching and pitch shifting techniques to get it into a range that can be heard by the human ear. An example of this might be NASA's Sounds of the Sun, which was published in 2018, using data on low-frequency waves that bounce around inside the sun. It was gathered by their solar and heliospheric observatory satellite, and the only processing in the audio that I'm about to play you is that it has been sped up 42,000 times to bring it into a range that you can actually hear. So let's take a listen to that. Here we go. So if you speed up the sun, that's what it sounds like. It's kind of mind-blowing, right? Then you've got ear cons and auditory icons, and we gave you a couple of examples of this earlier. It's like short little audio clips that represent events, and that includes phone notifications or the bloop of a barcode scanner in a supermarket that says this item has been scanned successfully. In Hermann's taxonomy, ear cons are abstract pings and bloop sounds, whereas auditory icons sound like the thing that they represent. So like a cash register ka-ching could be representing a sale, for example. And this can be a really simple but a very effective way to sonify event data or a change in state. And then finally, there's parameter mapping. And this is what most data folks think about when they hear the word sonification. And this is also the approach that we take with Loud Numbers, where you map data values onto different audio properties or dimensions, which we call sonic variables. We love this term sonic variables because it's kind of similar to the idea of visual variables that was proposed by the French cartographer Jacques Bertin in 1767.
1967,
sorry. 1967. These are position, size, shape, brightness, hue, orientation, and texture. And if you ever work with visualizing data yourself, you're probably somewhat familiar with this list. In a similar way, we've created a list of sonic variables that we like to use, parameters of sound that you can map to data. This is very much an incomplete list, but it includes things like pitch, volume, the type of sound, the timings of the sound, and much more, including effects, even pan, like where a sound is in the stereo field, whether it comes to the left or to the right. And all of these parameters can be used to encode and communicate data values. So you can also double or triple encode them by mapping the same data column to more than one audio property. And with the kinds of sonifications that we make, the choice of the sonic variables that you pick is really, really important. It has a really big influence on how effectively you're going to be able to communicate your data story to the listener. Now, with parameter mapping, as your data values change, your sonic variables change in a consistent, systematic way. And that means that once you've chosen your sonic variables, you then have to decide how those variables are going to be mapped. And that's a lot of kind of terminology and jargon. So I'll give you a super simple example. You might say something like, the larger the number, the louder the sound. And in that case, you would say that your data is mapped to volume. But you get to write the rule book about this. There is some academic research on sonification, but it hasn't really penetrated too far outside of universities, and there aren't very many conventions about how best to map data to sound. And the wider public absolutely has no expectations or preconceptions on this. And this is cool. It means you have a lot of freedom to explore and experiment with different systems. And that's either one of the most exciting things about sonification or one of its biggest drawbacks, depending on your perspective. But having said all that, we've found that different sonic variables work better than others in certain situations. Some of them, the ones near the top of this graphic, communicate data values we think with a bit more precision, like pitch. Other ones near the bottom communicate with less precision, but maybe more impact, like volume or reverb. And definitely some of them are easier for untrained or non-musical audiences to grasp than others are. This is the left-right position on the chart. So let's start with some of the easy ones on the left-hand side of the chart. These are variables that are immediate, they're universal, and they don't really require any cultural or musical knowledge. So this includes volume, tempo, panning, and also choice of instrument. Choice of instrument is really interesting. Even if your audience can't necessarily name what instrument they're hearing, they can usually recognize two slightly different sounds that come from the same instrument. And then there are the aspects of sound in the middle of this chart, which are slightly harder to process, perhaps. Pitch is a great example of this. Lots of people differ very much in their ability to tell different musical notes apart from each other. And 1 or 2 people in every 100 have a condition called congenital amusia, which means that they are tone deaf. They can't tell one note apart from another one at all. Simple sound effects like reverb and distortion probably also fall in this middle category. And then there are the sonic variables on the right-hand side of this chart, which are actually quite hard to grasp for a lot of people, requiring music or very culturally specific knowledge. This includes anything to do with harmony, which refers to chords and musical scales, and also to more complicated and disorienting audio effects like delay and filters. You can map data to these, absolutely, but they will require you to explain them if you're using them with a general audience, if you want them to understand what's going on. So in sonification, just like in any design process, you really need to work with your project's goals, its audiences, and the wider context in mind, picking the sonic variables that are going to work best for your data set. Now, in a similar way to this chart, we've also created another grid that shows a bit about the landscape of tools that you can use to make sonifications. On the left-hand side, you have simple tools. On the right-hand side, you have more complicated and powerful tools. And at the top are the ones that don't require coding skills. And near the bottom, you'll need more and more advanced coding knowledge and experience to get a good result. So in the top left, you've got the simplest tools like two-tone and CSV to MIDI, and a technique that we love called punk sonification, which was developed by researcher Jordan Wirfs-Brock, where you use your voice and objects around you to sonify data in very imprecise but very effective and impactful ways, because it's often coming directly from a human being. In the lower half, you find many of the sonification tools that are more complicated to use and require some coding knowledge. So this includes Sonic Pi, which we mentioned earlier, also Max MSP, which perhaps some of you have played with, and Super Collider. It also includes versions kind of in that quadrant that are available for most major programming languages like Python and R and JavaScript and so on. And you'll notice something about this, which is that it's kind of arranged from top left to bottom right. And we think that this is a real problem, that you can't do complex sonification work without knowing how to code. And that's a huge barrier to entry for people who might want to explore it with, more complex creative ideas. And that's why we've spent quite a big chunk of the last year building the Loud Numbers VCV rack module, which you see all on its own in the quadrant up there. That is well, so I'll tell you what it is first. It's a module for the free modular synthesizer simulator called VCV Rack. And it allows you to tap into VCV Rack's huge library of audio manipulation modules and tools, allowing you to use data to modify almost any aspect of sound that you can possibly imagine, depending on how you connect up the cables. There is absolutely a learning curve, to learn how to use this. It probably looks quite scary to some of you. But it's far smaller than the knowledge you would need to learn how to code from scratch. And actually, on Tuesday, just gone, we gave a workshop in Amsterdam where we taught people who didn't code how to use this tool in a single afternoon. And by the end of the afternoon, they were making sonifications with it. So it's you can use it even if it looks scary to you. And by releasing this free tool, it's completely free. We're really hoping that we can democratize and broaden access to sonification, bringing it out of the realm of professional coders and into the realm of musicians and sound artists who might be less technical, but who have perhaps a wider and broader range of creative ideas and experience.
So, what we've learned. So we hope that we've convinced you that sonification is really interesting as a communication tool and given you some ideas on how you might get started. And we just hope that you're excited about it, that you're as excited about it as we are. So to sum up, we just want to finish with 3 things that we found helpful when we first began our work with sonification, or in particular when creating sonifications for general audiences, non-specialists, and especially sonifications of time series data that are designed to tell a story or communicate a particular message. The first thing is to keep it simple. So small data sets of just a few rows are easiest to handle and generally work best if you're just starting out. You only need to map 1 or 2 variables to sound to create an effective result, and you don't have to sonify everything you have. So this was a mistake that we made first very early on in the podcast, is that we were so excited about the whole process. We just thought, we're going to sonify everything.
We threw it
all in, and we ended up with 9 data layers, and we were like, okay, this doesn't really work. You can't parse it very easily. So yeah, keep it simple in terms of the number of variables. And choosing data sets that show a very clear trend can be best. And that's sort of reducing the level of noise, so I mean statistical noise, not actual noise, in your data set can be a good idea to make your trend even clearer. So why is keeping it simple a good idea, at least to begin with? Well, one big reason is that most people are not familiar with sonification. It's not mainstream, or yet anyway. So if you're trying to introduce the idea of sonification to your audience, as well as the topic itself, a data set that's easy to follow is a much better bet than a complicated one that they can't make sense of. And as we explored earlier, moment-to-moment changes are everything in sonification. There's no quick overview. The limits to your auditory memory mean that most people will remember what they've just heard, and maybe what they heard a few seconds ago, and that's it. It's very hard to remember what happened at the beginning of a track, 3 or 4 minutes in. Also, there's no absolute values in sonification. There's only relative ones. So it's really important for listeners to hear the changes in the data as they occur. If you're looking for a simple data set to make a quick sonification and you don't want to do lots of data transformation work first, there are some sample data sets on the Loud Numbers GitHub page. They're all time series and they're all suitable if you're just starting out with sonification. So have a play around with those. The second big thing we've learned is to stay focused on the story that you want to tell. So here at Loud Numbers, we often write ourselves a headline or a key message that we want to communicate before we even start making our sonifications. And it's actually not for the listener, it's for us, just so we stay focused on what's the most important. It's a little bit like writing yourself a creative brief. And so how do you know what that headline is? Well, obviously, exploring the data first by analysing it and visualising it is a really good idea, and we often make exploratory plots first before we sonify. To reduce complexity and tell a clearer story, of course, you can transform your data, you can use average values, you can smooth it, you can put it in categories or bins and so on. And none of this will be too unfamiliar to those of you who work with data on a regular basis.
A third thing that you need to do if you want your general audience to understand your sonification is explain the system that you've used, a bit like we did earlier when we showed you those examples. As we've mentioned, sonification doesn't have very many conventions to it, and audiences will often come to it with no preconceptions or expectations, and so it's really, really important to just explain what's going on to them. One approach to explaining your system is to use an audio-only explanation, like we did in our podcast, where we just explain what the sonic variables are and what they're mapped to, and then we play the full track afterwards. And in audio-only formats like radio or podcasts, this is often the only option available to you. It also arguably encourages listeners to tune in maybe a little bit more closely to what you're saying, to your sound. But the downside of this is that your audience will have to remember all of these rules that you've set. And that's why, another reason why we said you should keep it simple. You can also use text descriptions or program notes to explain sonification work if you're in a situation like an exhibition, or if you're on a website, or even in a concert where people could look down at a program while listening. And then finally, you can take an audio-visual approach. And honestly, this is where we think it works best often when sonification is paired with visual components, but it does tend to require more resources to produce these animations, and so it can be a bit tricky. And then finally, I want to be really, really clear that the approach that we're outlining here today is just one approach to sonification, and it's one that is very centered around storytelling, the kind of storytelling work that we do. We found it to be a very quick way to get a good result, but there are plenty of other approaches that are common and very viable. Absolutely not every sonification has to be simple or has to tell a story. There are plenty of examples of sonification techniques being used by scientists to explore the kinds of enormous big data that we heard about earlier, or even to create complex generative music pieces where there isn't really a story to communicate. It's more about creating a mood and an environment. And this field is really it's a bit of a Wild West still. And there's lots and lots and lots of scope for experimentation and pushing out the boundaries. And that's really part of why we've enjoyed, exploring it over the last few years. But I think the main thing to remember is that ultimately you're designing your sonification for an audience, and what they need is the most important thing. So yeah, have fun and explore.
I would like to first welcome you all. And I would like to start with Emma, because our keynote speakers have done a lot of work in the environmental field. You are in the field of chemoinformatics, and you are signatory to a call for a global policy and science panel for environmental problems. So can you tell us a bit more about what you're doing and what are the challenges that you are facing when communicating about your research?
Yep, sure. And I'd like to thank the keynote speakers for a fascinating talk. So I've already followed up your GitHub account because you answered all my questions already. What do you need, CSV or text files? I have plenty of CSV and text files, I can say. So no, it's been fascinating. So I deal a lot with open science. So we've been trying to increase the availability of chemical information, and we've been weighing up a lot of challenges over the years. I've worked in European networks and now in Luxembourg for 5 years. And a lot of our problem, when I first was involved in this, we're trying to actually make data that's not available, so the sound of our data would be silence. We're trying to bring it to life. We just had a fascinating conversation actually with Jamie earlier. The challenge we're facing is that people are aware of tens or hundreds of chemicals, but what's actually out there are closer to millions or hundreds of millions. And how do you communicate the data that we're dealing with to make people appreciate you've got the sound of the silence when you can hear that the insects are dying out, but how can we make people aware of this pollution that you can't really see, but we definitely know that it's there? So part of our research is to try and make this available, to interconnect data, to present this to people in a variety of ways. It's been primarily visual. There hasn't been any sound right now. We've been looking at how to complement the diversity stripes or the climate stripes with chemical stripes, this kind of thing. And I found this actually a super fascinating talk, how you can tell a story with a very simple data set and visual, put it into sound. So. I don't know if that answered your question. But.
Yeah, thank you. Tom, next to you. When we did our preparation talk, you also mentioned about the challenges that you have. So Tom at the Statistical Office is working on predictive models. So you're using data produced by the Statistical Office to develop predictive models. And you have to communicate with policymakers, with journalists and with the broader public. So how are you finding this exercise?
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the very nice talk as well. Yes, so indeed, STATEC is not only making statistics, but I'm actually working in a field where we are using our own statistics, but other statistics as well, and we try to create knowledge out of this by making policy evaluations, by making forecasts. And so we have to, of course, first of all, understand what's going on, and then explain this to decision makers, mainly policy makers, but to a wider audience as well, as you mentioned. And it's very time consuming, and it's very complicated. So the topics itself are complicated, but in the end you manage to understand it. But the complicated stuff then is to explain this with easy words and really explain the big picture out of it in a very short time. I think that a lot of people have this challenge nowadays, and it's time consuming, and for sure we do not have the time, and maybe we don't even have the knowledge to do it, because you really have to have the qualifications of a journalist to some extent. So often we simplify our job by just preparing the knowledge for journalists, and they do the rest of the job. Okay, so then of course when we are outsourcing, we cannot control about the quality, how this will actually be understood to a wider audience. But in the end, it's compromise we do, because we don't have the time to prepare, let's say, it to 5 different types of communities. So the scientific community, where we are collaborating with, the journalists, the policymakers, or the civil servants in other ministries, because often the questions come from there. So we are trying to find answers to policymakers. So that's basically the main goal of our daily job. But then we are happy if we got the answers to them, and there we stop. And so we often hope that journalists take over and explain it to a wider audience, or if journalists don't do it, then people like the FNR, which are doing an excellent job in popularizing or disseminating scientific or economic data or whatever to a wider audience. So that's basically what we do and what we don't.
Well, you mentioned a couple of times journalists, so Lara will be the next one. So Lara, you are maybe a bit in a privileged position. You're a science journalist to start with, and you're also a member of faculty, so you give training to other journalists. So in your daily work, how do you go about to convey these sometimes complex topics? And I know we have discussed about this balance between simplifying without losing the essence.
Thanks. Thanks for invitation as well, and thanks for the interesting talk. As you mentioned, journalists a few times, and that they, I want to answer directly to this, because you said they need to be skilled and understand what you are preparing, and I think this is very important, because during COVID and at least the last couple of years, more and more data is in the world, and we have to deal with it. And there are a lot of journalists, maybe, or there should be more journalists who have basic knowledge and statistics and dealing with such data. So this is what we I also tell students, journalistic students who start in this area, this is very, very important. But what we do, I'm not a data journalist, I'm a science journalist, so we also deal with a lot of data in our everyday work when we read a paper, or we've seen data you collected or presented to the public. This is the one thing. And of course, then we ask ourselves, okay, what is, we don't create content. I'm working for digital platforms, more or less, for social media, YouTube, or our website. So we don't create content because there is the data. Also, what you said a lot, Miriam, there has to be a story or an answer, a question we can answer with the data. And of course, this is really a challenge because there is so much data out there right now. So we have to decide, and we also have to check what is the quality of the data. Is it a forecast data or is it a measured value? So this all we have to have in mind. And then what you said also, how can we simplify it that people that that are not used to see graphs and data all the time want to consume this? So we create, for example, infographics for our social media channels. And the main point is also really the story and the question the user should has. We want to answer this by data. And we discuss a lot how we visualize it, what we want to point out, and we try always to be transparent with the sources and maybe what's sure and what's unsure about the data. This is a challenge, but it's also a lot of fun.
Thank you. So the sound of data is between art and science, and so I would like to go back a little bit more on the artistic side of things with Jamie. So we heard a lot here about conveying data, about is data factual or not, but in the field of communication, at the end of the day, you want to convey a certain picture of what is going on. But you as an artist, you mentioned that you're deconstructing objects and data and rework them and give a meaning to them. So where do you see yourself? Are you a data artist? Are you a musician that is influenced by data? How would you define your work? What is the purpose of your work?
Fortunately, Patricia sent me this question a while ago, and it made me read my own biog and go, well, I don't understand what I'm talking about. So I say that my artwork tends to provoke a reaction, and I'm a sound artist and as well as a composer, but I found that doing music I did lots of different music for different things, but it wasn't allowing me to really engage with issues that I was interested in. I'm sure that Duncan and Miriam would agree that this is a really interesting way to explore and understand for ourselves and for audiences the what I call hyperobjects, which tend to be objects that are so big that even though they're affecting us all the time, we're not really aware of what they are or what they do. And one of my performance works is looking at 12,000 years worth of climate change data, and for me it was I wasn't expecting this, because it starts off as something that you're just playing with, but understanding as well as reframing and representing all of these different climate data sets, or any data set, using sound and music. One, it's a way to deconstruct this hyperobject, as we might call it, and two, it cuts through a lot of that noise that we have everywhere. It's no matter who I play a piece like that to, they'll always have something direct to say about how they feel about things. So that combined with an acknowledgement that there's always agency of the composer, agency of the artist, and also human bias in the data, that I think is what I like to do, and it can be all sorts of things. I'm really interested that you showed Alan from the FT. I've worked with Alan sonifying Twitter for a piece on COP26. And there was a tactical tech thing as well. I was like, oh yeah. I think that was exploring data privacy. So I'm still very, very interested in sonification, because for me it serves as a bridge between these two worlds. You could say it is art or music and science. You could say it's articulate fact and emotion, or you could say it's articulated and non-articulated. The thing is, it's really this form unto itself that is still, as you guys said, it's quite new, and so it's quite exciting to explore.
Thank you. And I'd like to look back with you, Miriam. If we look today at the landscape, at the media landscape, everything is very quick. More and more is just done on social media. Not too many people will read a newspaper, even not online. And so it's a bit of a challenge between the complexity of the topics that we're trying to convey and what people are ready to read and what the background of a journalist should be. So my question, or asking you what your opinion is it more about having a different approach to journalism, or does the regular journalism then coexist and work more together with people like you and Duncan and Jamie and other people that have been mentioned today?
I think there's a space for all approaches here. Bringing it back to sonification, I definitely think that sonification can be useful for journalists as a storytelling tool. But with those I don't want to say limitations, but definitely what you mentioned about limited audience attention spans, people wanting news to be very, very quick, a lot of news being consumed now through social media. These have to be taken into consideration when you're telling stories, and also with sound. So one of the things that we found, for example, is that sound doesn't always work well on social media platforms, because social media platforms expect you to have an image or a video. So if you want to create a sonification, it's often best to pair it with a video to reach a wider audience, because things like Twitter and Instagram are visually focused. But I do think that sonification has a role in storytelling, or can have a role, and that just as there is a role for long-form journalism, there can be a role for long-form sonic storytelling as well, where you're effectively expecting or requiring people to sit down for a few minutes, let's say, and listen to something from start to finish. And I think that can be really valuable as a way as an alternative media, and as a way of perhaps counteracting the impulse towards sort of fast news, bite-sized social media, sound bites that obviously does exist in our culture. But if I can, I just want to pick up on what something Jamie mentioned, which was this idea of hyperobjects, which I think is super interesting. So is it Timothy Morton's idea of that there are these things around us that are just so big that we can't grasp them. We certainly can't look at them as a whole because we're in them. Things like the economy, or even inflation, or climate change is the biggest example. And I think that in a way, using sound is so appropriate to navigating these enormous hyperobjects that affect our lives in myriad ways, but which you can never really look at all at once, because sound is so immersive, as we said in the talk, because you're always, as it were, in the situation that you're in, and you can never have that global overview of the whole thing, is fully appropriate to navigating the kinds of stories that we now find ourselves grappling with on a daily basis, that have to do with these enormous global forces that are now interacting in quite frightening ways in many instances. And also, to pick up on what Emma said about drawing attention to unseen, the unseen, and that also links back to hyperobjects, that they have such an enormous influence on our lives, and yet many aspects of them are invisible. And whether it's, you know, environmental chemicals or rising temperatures or whatever it happens to be, I think that sound can be incredibly useful in bringing the unseen to our attention. As can actually making data physical. And indeed, I think that there's huge potential for this very multimodal approach, where we're not just thinking about what we see, but also about what we hear, what we can touch, and perhaps even using taste and smell, which has been done in terms of communicating data, but perhaps is slightly more on the fringe there. But thinking about how we can make our experience of data much more multisensory, to try and communicate on many different levels at once, so that, you know, we're not just assuming a certain separation between the viewer and what is out there and the data, but actually kind of, let's say, using augmented reality to draw attention to the chemicals that are in the environment could be a possibility, or even using sound in conjunction with visual augmented reality to show that, you know, these things are around us all the time. I think there's huge potential there.
Yeah, I hope you're not going to use augmented reality for the economic forecast of the coming 12 months. It could look a bit scary. I would like, actually, unless you want to ask each other a question, I'd actually like to have some feedback from the public. Is there anyone who has a question? Oh, okay.
I really would like to know how the sonification of Twitter sounds like, because I perceive in the last couple of months or maybe years, Twitter is a very a platform where the people are very hard to each other, and the communication is very hard and quick, and then there are these strong sites where people see each other, and then and I would really like to know if you can hear this in the sonification, and if you can describe it.
Yeah, that was the dream to begin with. So I can talk about that specifically with you later. There's a few things involved with people's location, which has to be a choice that is put into Twitter. That means it's quite difficult. And you know, that one of the first things I thought about was how different people in different countries felt towards other countries. You know, to almost see like an emotional map that with sound you could see how people, say, in Iran felt about America, for example, people in Israel, so we won't get too much into it. And the actual sonification that I did was for COP26, and it took specific words, which in this case were the names of every world leader that was a delegate for COP26. And whenever their name was associated with climate change, it would trigger a sound. So they're just words triggering it. And the sounds that were used, I was thinking, well, what would be the sound that they would need to hear? So it was a huge research project to find sounds from marginalized communities around the world, or those at the forefront of climate change. And those sounds were the ones that were triggered. It was kind of like a choir of, you know, interrogation that happened. But I'd be very happy to show you.
And at least maybe, if I may, I would like to add that I really liked the example of the street sound map you two showed, because data is also always abstract in a way. So, and we also, what I as a journalist try to do is try to answer for the people the question what this has to do with me. And this map is a very good example where you not only can explore by color where the sound is more stronger than in other areas, but you can really hear it. And this is very cool example for me for this sonification and data journalism storytelling. Yeah.
Thank you. So, any questions? Actually, Duncan, you should come here. So if there are questions for you, you can answer them as well. Yeah.
I don't want to make you stand up.
No, it's okay. I can. No, this is for.
Okay.
Yeah, I need to. So, are there any questions in the room, please? There we go. Paul, back there.
Hello. Yeah, it was a really great talk beforehand, and also some of the examples you showed were, especially I think the one with the traffic noise, I think something that everyone can relate to. So that was a really good example. My question is quite specific. As a musician, the thing with sonification is that you've got your musician hat on, and there's some data sets that, because of the variance, are just maybe musically not so interesting. So there's a lot of the work, is that making some data sets that have not much variance musically interesting, and maybe vice versa? Or what has been your experience in terms of either commissions or compositions that you've been working on yourselves?
I'm going to answer that one because that's a subject that's really close to my heart, and it's something that I grapple with a lot. So yeah, I come from a musical background, as I said, and I'm always very, very keen to try to create tracks, and we both are, that are music. And I guess the way that we do that is it's a really, really tricky balancing act, because as you said, a lot of data does not lend itself to musical treatment. It might be very noisy. It might be that, you know, there are big changes in it, but they're all in the wrong place. I mean, you don't get data sets that fall naturally into verses and choruses. So, I mean, you either embrace the randomness and you create ambient tracks, or you create noise tracks, or you tap into a set of genre conventions where it really doesn't matter what happens when, as much as it would with something that's more structured like techno or a classical track or whatever it happens to be. Or you try and work in a way where you're looking for the musical features that do exist, like let's say you've got one enormous outlier in your data. Well, you make that the focus of your track. You can obviously choose the data sets that you're going to represent using sound. Some work better than others. And you can then crop the data set. You can amend the start and end point so that it works in a musical way. You can look for features of the data set, like, you know, if let's say the values start low and then they go up and get higher, like a lot of climate data does. Or they start high and then they get low, or maybe there's an arc shape to the whole thing where things get higher in the middle and then go down at the end. You can make the most of whatever is there. So with our podcast, for example, we've got one track which is really on the edge of sonification. It's actually more of a music track. It's on the number of the data that we used is the number of laws that exist in the EU database. Over time, very dry data. But we decided to set that, because it's about rules, we decided to set it to music that was very, very rule governed. So I wrote a fugue around that, and a fugue is a kind of a baroque musical form where you take a melody and then you transform it in a bunch of different ways. You turn it upside down, you make it longer, you do all sorts of clever stuff to it, and everything has to kind of fit together, like it's sort of technical. It's a bit like doing Sudoku with music or something. So this was obviously an enormous challenge. But what we found with the data that we had is that it did follow this very, very simple shape. It went up in the middle and then it went slightly down towards the end. And the way that we mapped that data to sound is we said, well, OK, let's just put all of that data. There were like 56,000 laws or something by the end. We'll put it in bins, and we're going to put it in 8 bins, or, you know, categorized it, and we set those bins to the voices in a fugue. That's the number of layers. So it starts off with like 1 layer, then there's 2, and then there's 3, 4, 5, and it goes up to 8, and then back down to 4 at the end. And that is a very, very simple mapping. So obviously we took something that was quite complicated, we radically simplified it, and then we turned that into music. And it worked in that case because we sort of knew what we were trying to achieve. But there is an awful lot of negotiation that goes on, a lot of trial and error, a lot of testing, a lot of like, hey, that might work, oh no, it doesn't. You know,
we tried to showcase in the podcast the data sets that we thought would work in a particular way, but there's a lot of exploration, a lot of trial and error.
I really want to hear what Jamie has to say about this, but just before that, I just want to add, like, I think that was a really great explanation at a detail level. I think at a very high level, it's kind of about what you want to achieve. If you want to make a track that people are likely to want to dance to, then you probably don't need to spend quite as much attention on making sure that the data representation is perfect. But if you do want to do something that communicates data, then maybe the danciness, can be less of a concern. Like, it's all about competing priorities, I think, more than anything else, and knowing what you want to achieve, really.
Have you tried it?
Well, two-tone, but it's the thing was I had difficulties trying to make that was the whole kind of interior dialogue of trying to make something musically interesting for myself with a data set that just wasn't working. It was sort of like having an instrument that just doesn't work for you.
Yeah.
So that was sort of part of the problem.
Yeah. I think the choice of data is probably like half the battle, because well, it needs to have some sort of potential meaning to you as the person who's going to make something out of it, and then then after that, it's kind of quite a lot of play. Just say you have that agency and you can choose something that is actually interesting to you. Then it's kind of really a bit like making music in general. You want to go off into uncertainty, reach the peak of your hedonistic curve, and then come back down into something certain, and then loop that process. So it's no different with sonification. You're experimenting with different sounds, different maybe modes, different kind of scales to put things on. And I guess there's a larger question about integrity to the data that we can talk about. But the main thing is to keep yourself interested. I don't think there's any point in doing anything if you're not interested in it. We can obviously talk about that.
Thank you. So just one follow-up question to that. Are there sonification purists, sort of like, I'm a guitarist, who are like, oh, only old school tube amps are the best? Are there sonification purists who are like, oh, it has to be the one-to-one kind of mathematical to be a valid sonification composition?
Yeah, I've got the sonification, we all agree, is, what did you call it, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, is just all sorts of practices and industries and, do it. And it ranges from, you shouldn't, it should, a heart monitor, that's all that's good. No, never do anything. It's properly scientific, and that's that could be exemplified by the auditory display community. They don't even call it sonification, and they're a very nice bunch, but they would keep things incredibly algorithmic for the purpose of maybe identifying differences in, solar tracking or something like that. It would be big data or very simple monitoring purposes. And I've been at a conference for the International Conference of Auditory Display, where they spend a huge amount of time really talking about that, the type of sound that should be used in a heart monitor for hours, so that's one end of the spectrum. And I suppose what we have here is a more story-based approach, which I think you should talk about. I sort of sit in the middle really of that because of my particular path. But I think it there's a process of rigor, I suppose, that only you will know, or whoever's doing the work will know. Do I feel like I'm representing this in an authentic way? And that would be the yardstick.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that whole idea of authenticity, and just also, you know, are you engaged in it or not? Like, do you feel something when you think about what it is you want to communicate, but also when you play back your sonification, like, does it move you? I think is a really important question, and that's, you know, that's a musical question as well, isn't it? But yeah, that's something that we always ask ourselves, like, do we feel something with this way of mapping, and if we don't, then we do something else.
I'd love to hear from the other half of our panel on kind of, yeah, well, I'd love to hear on what your take is on this question about whether the data needs to be perfectly accurately represented, or whether you can, I don't know, storytell, you have a bit more freedom to storytell with it in order for it to reach more people. Like, how do you balance up that in your science writing, for example, and in your communication work around what you do? Who wants to go first?
I do not have any degrees of freedoms in that respect. So we have a code of conduct. So as a statistician, well, a statistical institute, we have some rules. We need to be objective, even if that's maybe impossible, as you mentioned in the beginning of your talk. But yes, again, so we do. I mean, of course, we always try to have a storytelling. But yeah, again, we do not have a lot of freedoms into getting away from the original data. We present, well, give the numbers which are the numbers, and do not manipulate it in any way. That's one point. And the second point, because before you mentioned inflation, economic data, and so on. So tomorrow I have to go to the parliament and explain to deputies the impact of the policy measures to counter the energy crisis we currently live in. And there, that's at least my.
Are you going to sonify it?
Well, that would be fun. I love the idea of going there with a Bluetooth box and just playing a song. But well, yes, and then leave without saying a word, of course. Yeah. But you mentioned it at the end of your talk as well. So keep it simple, and maybe you should limit yourself to 2 variables, knowing that all the thing I do in my daily job is about hundreds and thousands of variables when speaking about my models. Then, of course, we simplify it before we communicate, but then still you end up with explaining the interactions between 10 or 20 different variables, or, well, these are complicated mechanisms, and we have to provide precise numbers, because that's what they want to hear. It's not, they always want a point forecast and not a range of forecast, even if we explain for years that it's impossible to make a point forecast for what will happen in 1 year, because we have no idea how this war will end in Ukraine, and so on and so on. So, yeah, the second part of my answer would be, I think that we are touching the limits of sonifications when thinking about what the, well, because the kind of answer I have to give are maybe too complex for sonification. But I might be wrong, so you can answer it.
Do you want to go? So should I? Okay. Yeah, so, I mean, I'm a scientist. We have to present facts, and then this obviously has to be accurate as well. But when you're dealing with chemicals, you're also dealing with something that's in everyone's lives, and they have an opinion. So as soon as they know I'm dealing with water, people often ask, you know, do you drink the water that's coming out of the tap? And can we drink it? And you say there's thousands of chemicals in this water. Is it still safe? So we have to communicate our research in a very factual manner. But if we present people with the number of chemicals that are currently matching some regulations, it's 6 million, and nobody knows what to do with 6 million chemicals. So how can we also present this information to the public in a way that they can deal with it, break it down? And we're actually in a fascinating EU project right now where we've actually got psychologists, and we're dealing with chemical products, and you know, how do you make people aware of what's in the products? How do you come up with alternatives? How do you change behaviors? And starting to come up with all these realizations that what people think are dangerous are not necessarily what we as scientists will think is dangerous, but they get an opinion and it's almost impossible to remove that opinion. How can you communicate differences? Like, okay, why is this object suddenly bad when actually there's an awful lot more that are just as bad? Or vice versa. So, you know, a lot of the alternative products look very good, but can have extremely high chemical contamination, but you're just not aware of it yet. Bisphenol A is something that almost everyone knows about now, but it's been substituted with other chemicals that are also of concern. How can we stop these kind of cycles? And I mean, this has just been a fascinating discussion. How can you also communicate a message in a different manner? We try to present facts to people, but if you present them, exactly like I said, too much information, they will pull out the bit that they want to know, but it's not the full story. How do we present that story? How do we excite people for the research? I think the introduction, I can't see where he is anymore, but the guy with the wine glass, he's hiding there somewhere, yeah. I mean, it's just exactly part of the story, right? You have to get the next generation interested in science and make this understandable for people, but also increase awareness and change behaviors. It's really fascinating as a scientist to try and present facts, but try and make this relevant for people. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe compared to you two, I have a little bit more freedom as a journalist, but I also, as a science journalist, I want to answer questions based on what science says. So also, of course, we are presenting, or we are not choosing whatever we want to show. But of course, it's part of my job to select what do we really want to show. For example, we had a discussion, or we wanted to make have a data project about the climate change, and we were first discussing a climate atlas to show more or less the key metrics of climate change, temperature, and so on. But then we decided really not to do it, because this is more or less only to show time series and these key metrics, and then we decided to answer the question, or try to answer the question, where do we see climate change in our everyday lives? And the one touch point we chose for that was the daily weather. So we compared the daily weather forecast with the data from a 30-year period for the exact day for this day and the city you choose from 1961 to 1991, because this is an official reference period for climatic metrics. Yes, and this was, for example, our way. So we choose we try to focus on what is the user question, or what is the question people want to have answered. So, for example, today, a day in October, it is, I don't know how many degrees it is today, but let's imagine it's 27 degrees. Is this temperature normal for a day in October or not? So then with our website or landing page, you can easily find out for your location. This is what I wanted to say, but I also wanted to say when we select information or data, what you two maybe created, then we always have to be careful what we leave out, or what we point out, what colors do we choose, because we have a very smart community, and they always find out if we make a little mistake. So we have this corrective in the comments. So to get to your question back, it's in the end we cannot as a journalist choose whatever we want to show. There are smart people out there who control what we as journalists do, even in social media.
The gatekeepers.
Yeah.
So anyone else, or are you ready for a drink and want to discuss that with the drink? Virgilio. He is actually one of our artists in residence at the Sound of Data.
Yeah, I'm exploring this thing. About the accuracy of the sonification, I would like to know your opinion about the scale or the values. Because when you listen to something, what's the base? What's the reference? You don't know. And it's very difficult to be accurate if you don't know what percentage or what values we are listening to. For example, the natural lottery is about melting river, but what are the degrees? What is the beginning in the early 20th century? It's like, I don't know, well, the degrees is the date. It's like June, July, or is like March. And in 2020 is, I don't know, March, or is July, or is September. The point is, when you listen to the data, you don't have reference or context. So how the audience can understand it without external explanation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I guess there's like two related things here. One is knowing where you are in time. Let's say you're sonifying time series data, and the other one is knowing where you are according to the reference to the mapping system that you set up, whether it's pitch or volume or effect or something else. Time, first of all. I mean, one thing that we find really useful is having some kind of one-to-one relationship between units of time in the data set and units of time in the music. Let's say 1 beat is 1 month of data, or 1 beat is 1 year of data, or whatever it happens to be, rather than being abstract and saying 1 second is 1 year or one month. So that you can directly hear the time points passing. I mean, you could think of it as almost like a click track, as being analogous to like the tick marks on a chart that show you little increments passing. With the example that you talk about, the natural lottery one, we do actually use little samples of me saying the names of the years. So it starts in 1933, and then bum, bum, bum. And I think the system that we used in that track was that 2 bars, so that's 8 beats, was 1 year, if I remember rightly. It was something like that. But there is a one-to-one. Well, there's a sort of clear connection between the data time and the musical time. But then on to the other part of that, which is what's your reference point? You know, when you're listening to a sonification, that's a really good question, because it is hard to create those reference points. But you can try. So one thing that you can do, for example, is if you're using pitch to map to data, you can play, let's say you've got a trend that's going up or something, you can play the starting point pitch at the same time. Of course, you can hear 2 pitches at the same time. So if you imagine like a line that's used as a reference point on the graph on a chart, and then there's the data itself, or the baseline, yeah, no pun intended, but yeah. So you can do things like that. But yeah, a really important question when you're creating a sonification is like, what are my range extremes? What is the highest value in my data set, and what's the sound that will be associated with that, and what's the lowest value, and what's the sound that will be associated with that. And the space in between is the space you've got to play with. And if your extremes work, then everything in between is, broadly speaking, going to work as well. But yeah, keeping in mind what those extremes are, it can be a challenge for sure.
Thank you. We have one more question, the last one.
Yes, thanks very much.
Just very briefly, because we're running a bit out of time.
I'd just add that sometimes it doesn't matter that much. So, for example, this is called if only data couldn't talk. If it was literally talking using words, we're kind of missing the point. So there's always some room for you to just be using music, and for people to get the message that they get from a non-articulated experience. So just to add to that.
Yep. Thanks very much. So often when we want to represent some data, what we want to do is get a sense of associations between variables. And I was wondering whether you had any ideas of how to represent associations between variables using sonifications. Harmony or dissonance, or in your experience, you have tips and tricks and ways to represent associations between variables using sound.
That's a good question. We haven't really done many sonifications that were about exploring associations, but I guess off the top of my head, the idea of using notes that are consonant with each other, so like they're in harmony and they sound good together, and then maybe using more dissonant things for where there isn't an association, or using unison and then notes that move, that almost like overlap where there is an association, but that is literally just off the top of my head. Have you got anything?
I have one thing off the top of my head as well, which is that if you've got two variables, you've got two ears. You know, you can kind of have one playing in one ear and the other one playing in the other ear. And, you know, that can be a bit confusing for people. Like, that is definitely not on the left-hand side of the big chart that I showed. But, you know, depending on your audience, it might be something that works for them. And it can, you know, people who can keep track of, especially maybe like simpler variables like volumes. If you hear both ears getting louder at the same time, there's quite clearly a relationship there. Whereas, you know, ears that are, you know, one is getting louder and the other one is getting quieter, you're not going to have so much of a relationship. You know, I think you can think about it almost as simply as that.
Well, thank you very much for coming out. Thank you to the people who made all the way to Luxembourg. The purpose was to seed the idea that sonification might be an interesting tool for communication, for science, for data communication, and don't hesitate. You know, if you have any questions, send us an email. The whole there's going to be a video produced and put on the science.lu YouTube channel, so you'll see it when it comes out. And thank you again, and please, there are some drinks and something to nibble next door. Thank you.